Welcome to the next video in our Tailmaker series. Last time we promised that we would show how NPC nodes can branch, and also, cookies. Well, we lied about the cookies. Luckily, NPC branching is almost as fun. Like player nodes, NPC nodes can have siblings as well. Two or more nodes that share the same parent and exist at the same level in the hierarchy. Tailmaker parses a conversation by starting at the top and working its way down from parent to child. When it encounters sibling player nodes, it stops and waits for player input. Simple. But when it encounters two or more sibling NPC nodes, what does it do? The nodes have the same parent, but there's no player input involved. How does Tailmaker know which node to play? The answer is Tailmaker does a conditional test. And of course, just as with player nodes, we can have as many sibling NPC nodes as we want. Let's just stick to 3 for our sanity, though. Sibling NPC nodes have a conditional test on them. If the test returns true, Tailmaker plays that node. If the test returns false, it drops to the next node in the list and tests that. If you have 100 NPC nodes, Tailmaker will test all the way down until it finds the test that returns true. If the very bottom node has a conditional and it returns false, then the conversation will just quit. And that may be what you want. But in most conversations, we leave the bottom node without a conditional, so that if everything else returns false, we know that node will still play. It's like a safety node. You can see how this process creates another kind of branching. This one is automatic and happens behind the scenes, so to speak. The player is unaware that this is happening, so the NPC's response seems natural and the only response the NPC would give. Being able to direct the flow of the conversation behind the scenes, without the player knowing, is an incredibly powerful branching tool. How does the condition test for true or false? There are 3 different ways, and you choose which one. You can test a counter. For that, you create a variable and test what its integer value is. More on that in a moment. You can test for a node, which is a more complex function we can talk about another time. Or you can test a Boolean, a simple true-false statement. For this example, let's set up a variable for a counter, and let's say that the player needs something from Francis. We enter the UI, help me, and the player line, I need the ring of fever dreams. Now let's say that in some other part of the conversation, or some prior interaction, or just anywhere in the game, the player was mean to Francis. They said something about her mother. Let's go back to the player's request and give Francis 2 possible responses. 2 sibling NPC nodes. The top one has a conditional on it. Tailmaker automatically adds this as a convenience, but the conditional is empty, so let's add a counter to it. We'll create a variable called wasMean. Now, we will test if it is greater or equal to 2. Maybe if the player was mean to the NPC once, that's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. But if the player was mean twice, it's a problem. If this returns true, indicating that the player was mean twice, Francis will say, no ring for you. But if they were never mean to them, or they were only mean once, then this will return false, and Tailmaker drops down to the next line. Sure, here's the ring. Now we've branched the story using conditionals. How does Tailmaker know if the player has been mean earlier? Well, let's say up here, and this could be anywhere in this or any other conversation, the player chooses violence. You smell. Tailmaker will know that the player insulted Francis because we will set an action on that node. There are 3 types of actions we can set: Booleans, counters, and events. Events are a bigger topic we will tackle elsewhere. Booleans and counters you may recognize from when we talked about conditions. We're using a counter in this example, so let's add an action that increases a counter. You'll notice that the variable we created before, wasMean, is already populating this list, so we don't have to retype the variable. If you've created a variable elsewhere, it'll be waiting for you. This avoids a lot of bugs. We can increment or decrement our counter. Let's increment it by 1 in this case. Now, if the player chooses this response, this node will play and this action will run, which means wasMean gets incremented by 1. Later, when the player asks for help, the game will test the condition on the NPC node and return false because wasMean is still less than 2. This means Francis will say, sure, here's the ring. But if we give the player another chance to be nice or mean in the next exchange and the player chooses to be mean a second time, the variable wasMean will get incremented again. Now when the player asks Francis for help, Tailmaker will test the variable wasMean and see that it is 2 or greater, so it'll return true. That means the NPC node, no ring for you, plays, leaving the player to regret their earlier choices. When we branch this way, it leads to different storylines. If the player was mean, the conversation goes down this path. If they were nice, it goes down this other path. It's a very robust, straightforward system. You can add actions onto NPC nodes just as easily as on player nodes. For example, let's add an action onto the NPC node where they said no and create a Boolean variable called saidNo. Now, when that node plays, that Boolean is set to true, and the game will always know that the NPC said no to the player here. You might wonder, why test that if we already know that wasMean is set to 2 or greater? Because the player may have been mean and got the wasMean variable up to 2 or greater, but they may not have asked the NPC for help yet. The saidNo variable lets us test if the player asked and was refused. If we have a node where the player says, "You didn't help me last time and I needed it," we can add a conditional that tests if saidNo is true. The player will only see this node if Francis refused them in the past. The characters remember what happened. That's how conditions work on player nodes. If it returns true, the node appears with other player choices, giving the player the option to say it. If it returns false, then it simply doesn't appear in the list of possible responses. If there are multiple player choices with conditions, and only one of them returns true, or if there's only one with no condition, then that line will autoplay, just as if it was always meant to be a linear conversation. You can already see how the logic of branching can get quite complex very quickly, which is why TaleMaker's dead simple scripting system and visual structure is so important. On many teams, the narrative designer is kept away from complex scripting because they're creative. This means that a technical designer or someone else must scroll through the conversation and figure out where and how to script it. But this technical designer did not write the conversation and does not necessarily understand everything the narrative person is trying to do. It requires a lot of communication and just represents a huge time sink for the project, with associated opportunity cost. TaleMaker avoids all that by empowering the creatives to script their own conversations easily and intuitively. With these tools, the game remembers every choice the player has made and everything that an NPC has said or done. All of the variables we've discussed here, such as counters and booleans, can also be set outside of narrative events. If the player kills a boss or has something in their inventory or visited a certain castle, those things can be set in the game and then imported into the conversation to be tested or modified. The result is a world that reacts to the player and characters who remember what was said or done. That's it for this time. Please tune into our next installment where we will talk about TaleMaker's super secret sauce. You don't want to miss that.